Okay, I think we're good here. All right, so nice. Dope. So what I'm gonna do is share my screen and get us back to a point where we can kind of see what's going on with this app we've been building. So I pulled up my VS Code from the project that we worked on last, and essentially we are starting to build out a tic-tac-toe game, right? And if I go live on this so that we can see it on the browser, so far we kind of got to a place where we got the board ready. We got a nice square board of different squares, and we're getting ready to start doing the actual JavaScript portion where we can make this board interactable, which is really dope, right? This is going to be like a actual application that people can go to, actually interact with the web page and make something unique happen. So I'm super excited about wrapping that up today. But just as a recap of how we got there, right? We're building this in vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so in order to build this game, we need to define those three files. So with any web project, like a front-end web design project, you're always going to have some combination of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, right? HTML is the structure and skeleton of your website. It is where you would define all of the visual components, or the visual elements, I should say, of your site. And all of those are stored in the HTML body. So there's a tag in HTML that represents all of the visual components that we're going to see on the site. And that's stored in the body. The HTML file also contains a head, and the head is where we kind of relate to the metadata of the document. All HTML is stored in what we call a document, an HTML document, and the HTML tag and element represents the root of that document. HTML is structured in a nested like tree-like structure where there's a root and then there's nodes underneath the root that kind of can have nodes within them and children of those nodes. So you can think of HTML like a tree. And we also started talking about how HTML connects with CSS, and CSS is the style and the stylistic portion to our websites. And so there's a whole lot that goes into the HTML. There's so many different types of elements. And with CSS, there's also a lot that goes into the structuring of websites within CSS. But the most important thing to understand here is that when you start defining out elements in HTML, you can use CSS to find those different elements and give those elements various styles. We call those styles rules. And in CSS, you define rules with key value pairs where, like, you know, there's different CSS rules for like stuff like the height, width, color, stuff like that. And you use those rules to define the styles for a particular set of elements. And in order to choose the set of elements, we use what's called a selector. And in CSS, the selector is everything we see on the left-hand side of these curly braces that signifies a specific element that is utilized, or that is basically going to be targeted by the styles to receive the styles that we've given it in the rule. So on the left side, you say, what elements am I looking for? It can be a singular element where you take the HTML tag name of a particular element and then say, hey, for every element that is of this type, give it this style. So a good example of this would be like these first two CSS rules we see, where on this first one from line 1 to 3, we see that we're selecting the body element. So VS Code has a nice feature where if you hover over the left-hand rule, the left-hand selector, it'll tell you what element is going to be targeted by this particular CSS rule. So line 1, clearly this is targeting the body tag, right? And so we only have one body tag in this HTML document, which means that anything that this body is what's going to be receiving those rules. And so we also have this sub CSS defined for this heading that's saying, hey, for whatever heading H1 element we find, we're going to give it this particular font size or whatnot. So inside of that body, there's one H1 element that's going to receive those styles. We can also use CSS to target elements more specifically by, we can also target more generally elements that are utilizing certain shared parameters, right? A very important shared parameter or what we call an attribute of an element would be its class name. And a class name is essentially a attribute that we define in an HTML element where we pass in some particular data to element to know for itself. So class is one particular type of attribute that allows you to basically uniquely identify a set of elements. The difference between a class attribute and an ID attribute is that classes can be utilized multiple times, like we see here with this class called square, and IDs can only be utilized once. So it's very common that you'll see both of them utilized in a HTML file, but just know that the difference between them is basically you can only have one element with an ID, and you can have multiple elements with a class name. Elements can have both IDs and class names. That's also important to know as well. And there's other attributes to elements that are important. Styles, CSS styles are also attributes of an element. The difference is that you can use attributes, you can define attributes literally within the HTML, but some attributes like styles are better off having kind of defined in a file, so it's easier to identify and change. And that's why we use CSS files. But there's also other ways that you can style elements and just use the attributes inside of HTML to manipulate that in and of itself. So cool. This is kind of like where we got to with our HTML file. So the board that we're looking at is the square board that we're looking at is kind of mostly comprised of this div, this big div container that we called a board with the ID board that then has 9 divs that are representing squares inside of it, right? And we talked a little bit about divs. Divs are a kind of like an empty container-like element within HTML. They allow you to kind of wrap other elements in a container, and then you can style the container itself. So divs are a really commonly used element in HTML. And what we're seeing with these squares is that we're targeting that all those same elements with the shared class name square, right? We're targeting those and giving them some specific parameters, some specific stylistic attributes. Like we're giving them a height and a width, right? We're giving it we're giving it a border. We're giving it some parameters to make it so that it's displaying itself in a flexible way so that it can be moved within the container. And we're kind of aligning all the information it has so that it's centered inside of it. And similarly, so I'll just say first, this particular set of rules is what's defining kind of this board-like structure that we're seeing here, right? If I just started tweaking some of this and maybe getting rid of the border, for instance, we're going to see a massive change in how the document gets shown up, right? Because that border is really what's showing the board as it actually is with the lines, right? So borders add lines to things, and all these little CSS rules were important to get the board to kind of be seen the way that it actually is showing up. So just wanted to kind of highlight that. Last couple bits of CSS that we have in here, I put some, I kind of like had it all in one at first, but I separated it into 2 different classes. One is for a flex container, which basically is a div container that's saying, hey, for every element inside of this big container, make sure that it's aligned and justified in the center. So that makes it horizontal and vertically aligned, and make it so that we can position the elements inside of it flexibly, right? And I gave the container, both the board needed that so that it could manipulate those squares inside, but also when I wanted to make the whole thing vertically aligned in the or horizontally aligned in the page, right? So make it kind of aligned, centered in the page. I use that same class for another div that was kind of wrapping it. And then lastly, the flex wrap was the styles that we used to make sure that the board had this element of like only showing 3 of these containers, these div squares, in one row. So the flex style flex wrap was what allowed us to make that wrapping possible. And so, you might be seeing this and be thinking like, how do you know all this stuff? Like, where would I even go to get started with like CSS and all of that? And the truth is, CSS is one of the hardest parts of front-end development, right? Design is the most tricky part. So again, I really value the W3 schools as a resource, and I highly recommend that you pour over it. They have really awesome tutorials and references to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that I highly recommend. It's a free resource. You can use the CSS reference to learn more about all of the different CSS properties that exist, right? So like, say for instance, you're like, I want to, to change the background color, right? So you could come to this reference and like type in something like background color and see, oh, there's a background color CSS selector or CSS rule, excuse me, that I can use to change the background color, right? So that's, and I'll be honest with you, there's times where I don't know a certain CSS that exists, right? Most of the ones that I do know, I know from just common use cases, and we'll talk about some of those over time. But a lot of it, I come and look up, just figure some stuff out. Or, one of the benefits of like being on the web is like, you can see some of the source code for other sites that are doing something similar to what you're attempting to do. So for instance, if I like some of the CSS that's here in the W3 schools, I could look up, like, I could inspect the page and take a look at some of the source code here and look through some of the CSS that they use to say, oh, how might I want to structure my CSS so that it's kind of similar, right? So here you could see some of the CSS that they're working with on some parts of the page. So CSS in and of itself takes a minute to learn, but the W3 schools CSS tutorial, I think, has some very practical use cases of stuff that you might want to learn how to do, right? Changing colors, backgrounds, the things about they go into all kinds of stuff in here. So I definitely think it's worth the look. And cool. Did somebody have a question? I think I saw somebody raise their hand.
I have a question, Professor.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you can give as many class names as you want for a div?
Yeah, so elements can take as many class names as you want to give them. You can separate class names with a space, and elements can have multiple class names. So this could be like class name 3,
That just means that you're gonna take the properties of all those classes.
Right. Yep. It means that it'll take whatever styles are defined in here.
Oh, okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep. Great question. Cool. So that's kind of a recap of like where we got to last class with the HTML and the CSS. The only other things to talk about are how we connected those pieces, right? So we know the HTML is the structure. We know the CSS is the style. We used a link tag in CSS to link we use the link HTML tag to link our CSS to our HTML file. This is a very common element that you'll see used often, is like a link to a style sheet. And so this is what connects our CSS style sheet to our HTML document. And similarly, when we were trying to connect our JavaScript, we see that we can use this script tag to actually embed some JavaScript. And so the script element is an element in HTML that allows you to define some JavaScript that you're going to run with that HTML. So there's a number of different ways you can put JavaScript into an HTML file. One of the ways is to link a JavaScript tag to a particular source file or some source code in JavaScript. and it'll run that source code as it calls this script. By default, scripts run as soon as they get called, as soon as they kind of come up. So in this case, we didn't want, because I put this in the head, I didn't necessarily want this to run immediately. So I used a defer attribute to make it so that the JavaScript would wait until the entire HTML rendered first before it actually ran this script. So that was just important given the fact that this was in the head. I could move this from the head to like somewhere else in the body, and that would solve that problem, and I wouldn't need the defer tag. But because it was in the head, I put that in there. So that's kind of a recap of where we got to last. And then we started kind of talking about the JavaScript piece. And with that connection of the script tag here, that is what allowed us to say, oh, this index.js is going to have some JavaScript inside of it that's going to run when our page is being loaded. And so if I were to inspect this page one more time and just peep the console, we should have that console log coming out that is we should have that console log coming out that is tied to the array that we kind of built last. So yeah, today we're going to kind of keep going on this tutorial and talking more about the JavaScript portion. But before we push forward there, just kind of want to get a show of hands or show of thumbs real quick. You know, thumbs up if this is cool. You feel like you understand kind of where this HTML and CSS is at right now.
Could you run over the setting up the array?
Like yeah, I'll do that. Yeah, I'll touch on that for sure. No problem. Cool. Okay, cool. Thank y'all. Appreciate y'all. Dope. All right, bet. So since that part is good with the HTML and CSS, we're gonna jump right into the JavaScript portion and kind of almost start over from where we got to last. So I'm gonna take this section out real quick just to show. So basically what we have here is a JavaScript file, right? All things good here. We worked on some JavaScript code the other day, and we know that the console.log is our print function, which is lit. This is just printing something for us. So I'm just gonna say hello from the JavaScript file. And then we know that JavaScript console.log is printing to the console. When you have JavaScript tied to an HTML file, or it's on a server tied to an HTML file, the console is referring to the browser console. So this is where all of your console logs are going to come out. So if you're looking for where this is happening, it's happening here. And this is different than when you run Node in the terminal, right? Because I can also run a JavaScript file strictly in the terminal. After installing Node, you can just run Node with that particular, you can run Node with the path to that particular file. So this index.js file is actually inside of another folder called JS. So if I run node.js index.js, right? I can also run that JavaScript file just on the terminal. The difference is that when you use it on the terminal and you're using Node, the console refers to the terminal. But when you are connecting your JavaScript to an HTML file, the console refers to the browser. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're working on the front end and on the client side, the console is going to be in the browser. If you're working on the back end and using Node in the terminal, it's going to happen on the terminal. So that's just important to know. Cool. So I will keep the console up because it might be the case that we want to look at it a little bit more. I'll close some of this stuff that we don't really need for right now, though. And so let's talk about this JavaScript piece and what we got to do to make our game work and start defining the JavaScript for the game. So there's a couple things we need to do in order to make this game work, right? Tic-tac-toe is an event-driven game, right? It works off of two users normally are playing a game, and they have to click on, or they have to, select certain parts of the board that they want to put their move. And we want the board to kind of update there. If you're doing this in person or writing, you would write X or O somewhere. But because we're doing this virtually, the only system that we have available to us is maybe like taps. we might, we could maybe make an interaction that kind of registers, oh, did they like, draw an X or draw an O? That would be a kind of a very sophisticated thing on the browser to do, but it's possible. But for now, we're going to just go with the idea of the user taps where they want to place their move, and it'll kind of rotate turns, X's turn, O's turn. So the big kind of event that we need to be able to register are clicks. So that's one thing we need to do. So like, let's just think about some of the things we need to do. One thing we need to do is, I'm gonna just kind of write to do, and then kind of make a little list real quick. One thing we need to do is like register clicks from the user on the board, right? That's definitely something that we need to do. After we register the click from the user on the board, what do we want to do? Well, we want to determine whose turn it was and mark that spot on the board, right? And then we might want to switch turns, and then the process kind of continues. And then somewhere along the line, we're going to want to know, we're going to want to determine if there's a winner to the game. Right. So these are kind of the big to-dos that we want to kind of knock out for ourselves. And in order to do this, we're going to try to use JavaScript to make all of this possible, right? And so this is where the JavaScript part comes into play, because JavaScript is a programming language. So we can use this programming language to make this very smart system for registering all of this stuff. And so that's exactly what we're going to do to make this possible. So first things first, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of start the process of like figuring out how can we have the JavaScript represent like a new game for us, and like someone setting up this game, and we're kind of start playing the tic-tac-toe the way that we want to. Last class, we talked about the fact that with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, there's actually a very helpful interface that we can use with JavaScript to connect our JavaScript to the HTML in ways that will allow us to get access to all the elements that we've previously written on our HTML and make some changes to the HTML. Right. And so that interface is called the DOM, the HTML DOM, or the document object model. And I remember I told y'all this is a very important concept. So I highly recommend you write this down and you kind of try to get an understanding of what this is. The HTML DOM is basically just an interface that turns our HTML document into an accessible tree of objects that we can use JavaScript to manipulate. And, there's all types of things, adding, changing, removing, updating elements. JavaScript can do all of that with the DOM, and it can do it with the HTML elements. It can do it with the CSS, and it can do it with any other attributes like that elements might have. So the HTML DOM is one of the most important concepts to how JavaScript is able to make websites more interactive and dynamic. So when we think about like registering clicks from the user on the board and, marking the spot on the board, that's going to involve some pretty interesting manipulation of the HTML from the JavaScript side, right? And so that's where we're going to want to start figuring out how we're going to make that possible using the document object model functions that come pre-built into JavaScript. So boom, let's make this happen. One of the first things that we wanted to do was thinking about this game, right? In order to kind of register where a user's tapping, we want to know where on the board where on the board is a user making a move, right? And so representing the board in this sense, right? This board that we made in HTML is going to be really important to the game, right? Am I right? So the first thing we might want to do is figure out how can we represent this board that we're looking at in HTML in JavaScript, because we want to make sure that the JavaScript knows what's going on the board at all times. So we know where a person made a move, we know all those types of things. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to create, we're going to use JavaScript to create a system for monitoring the board that is created in HTML. And in order to do that, what we're going to need to do is kind of define some variables and define some functions, right? So firstly, what we're going to do is, I just want to recap what we talked about the last session of just kind of how JavaScript is going to support us in the process of understanding kind of where our board is at, right? And knowing kind of the state of all of the different elements inside of the board, right? So let's take it a step at a time. And the first thing I want to do is kind of, let's just define some of the variables that we might need to make this game possible, right? So clearly we're going to need a board. So for now, I'm just going to put a new variable in this JavaScript file. I'm going to call it a board, right? So we use the let keyword to define a new variable in JavaScript. What we're seeing here is a declared variable, but it's not set to anything, right? So it's just saying, hey, I have this new variable called board. Right now, it doesn't have any kind of, it's not tied to any specific type, so it has type of any. But this is now a variable that I can make reference to elsewhere in this JavaScript file. What else might we need? Well, we might want to know like whose turn it is. So let's just say for right now, the first player's turn is X, right? And later we might turn this to O, right? But for right now, we'll start with X. And yeah, so we can start with those two. The next thing that we're gonna want to know is we're gonna want to essentially understand how we're gonna want to start the kind of process of like when someone is playing the game, like setting the game up, right? So setting it up so that, we're getting ready to play this game and we understand, we know that the board is going to be empty and we're going to start playing the whole game and play tic-tac-toe, right? So one of the things that might be helpful is to have a couple functions, right? So maybe one function we have is like an init function, right? And init might be just a function that we call to start the game. And so I'm going to write this as an arrow function. So again, arrow functions basically are functions defined almost like a variable, but they use this arrow syntax. And this is a newer version of writing functions in JavaScript these days. So here I define this init function. And inside of this init function, maybe this is where we will set up the game, right? And we could talk about that in a little bit. Later, once we've figured out how to start the game, we might just want to actually initialize the game, to start a new game. So every time this JavaScript actually loads, right? So every time the HTML file runs and the JavaScript loads, the first thing we want to have happen is like, we define whatever variables we need, and then we actually initialize the game and we can start playing our tic-tac-toe game, right? So what might be something that we need to initialize every time the game starts? So every time this gets loaded or reloaded, right? What might be something we need to initialize? If anybody has a thought, you can shout it out if you want to shout it out. But
to make the board.
Yeah, we might have to make the board, right? Like that makes a lot of sense. Like every time you refresh, you wouldn't want the old game to stay up there. You would probably want to start a new game. So the most important thing here is the board. So clearly we're going to want to do something here with the board. So I'm just going to put a comment to say set up a new board. Cool. That's a great point. And so essentially, let's talk about how we might want to reflect the board in this game, right? We know that in tic-tac-toe, the board is like 9 squares or 9 areas that you can actually mark. But in JavaScript, it's like, okay, well, what's the best way for us to reflect this as a data, as in data, right? We have strings, we have Booleans, we have, we have those data types, numbers and whatnot. But, we're actually looking at a big list of different potential areas, right? So when you think of like a list of particular data, what do you think would be the best data type for us to use?
Like chars,
Say again?
characters, because it's just like X and O.
Yeah, we could use characters to reflect the we could definitely use characters to reflect like the places that like the X's and the O's. That's definitely true. But when we're trying to, yeah, an array for like storing a list, right? If we have like, so we're gonna have a list of all of those X's and O's. So it makes sense to think about, okay, maybe it might make sense to keep this as an array. So we know, hey, like, you know, our array is gonna keep track of all the X's and O's on the board. Does that make sense to folks in the chat? If it makes sense to you in the chat that we're going to use an array, just say, yeah, that makes sense. Appreciate that. Dope. So the idea here is that we got to keep a reference to 9 areas of the board, right? So maybe what we might want to do is create an array for the board. So we now we're actually kind of use this board variable, right? And in the init function, we're saying, hey, take that board and turn it into a new array, right? And maybe that array, like you were saying, is storing characters, or, you know, in JavaScript, everything's really starts out as a string. So even like simple 1-letter characters or 1-letter strings are gonna kind of be strings. So we're gonna keep a list of strings. So I'm gonna just kind of put 9 empty strings for right now. Right, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Right, so I got 9 empty slots, right? And this is our board, like these 9 empty slots. This new board, every time the game starts, we're gonna have these 9 empty slots. In order to even make this even more make sense to us, maybe I can, you know, in JavaScript, it doesn't care about the spaces in the tab. So I can actually enter and like kind of make this look even more like, like a board. Let's see. Yeah. Something like this. Right. Right. So here, this is kind of saying like, yeah, we got 3, 6, 9 places that will eventually be, you know, we're full of X's and O's and X's and O's. Right. And that's kind of how we're going to reflect this, this board. If this makes sense to you, just given what we're saying right now, just give me a thumbs up right quick in the chat or right here. Dope. Appreciate this. Thank y'all. Thank y'all. Cool. So we're going to use this array to keep track of all the spaces that are filled on the board, right? But when we start the game, we're not going to want to initialize it with any X's and O's. That would defeat the purpose, right? And that'd be like, you know, cheating. So, you know, we're not out here to cheat. We're out here to finesse. So cool. So we got our init function going. We got our init function set up, and we're kind of good on this. So now that we have the game initialized, right? Our board is kind of being put to is being set up in the memory of our JavaScript program, right? Now we can use that board and manipulate that board within the JavaScript context. But the next question is, okay, so cool, we have an array, you know, we can put X's and we can put O's and we can do all of that. But how's this actually going to translate to turning into something that actually is going to be seen here, right? In a very real way, like the data that's changing over time in this JavaScript file has to kind of be, for lack of better words, rendered on the screen. Like we're going to want to see those changes reflected on this screen here, right? So how are we going to do that, right? What we're going to want to figure out is how can we actually get this information from the JavaScript, from this board here, to be put into our actual HTML in an actual way that makes sense, right? And this is where we're going to want to start using some of those document object model functions to kind of figure out how can we get the JavaScript to connect to our HTML in a more structured way. And some of that we talked a little bit about last class, about how we can use some JavaScript functions to get references to our board and elements that we're going to use over and over again in our game, right? Like, and so let's just kind of do that process again. So we're going to take a quick pause on our board right now and think about the next step here in this init function is we're going to want to render the changes or render the new board in our HTML, right? That's kind of what we want to figure out how we're going to do. But first, let's just talk about these document object model functions that exist and how we can use, what are some of the more important JavaScript functions that we're going to want to know. So I'm just going to move over to the document object model methods section of the W3 schools, where it'll tell us a little bit more of the functions that we can use to interact with the HTML DOM with JavaScript. So some of the important methods that we use in JavaScript when it comes to the document object model, the get element by ID function, which allows us to find an HTML element based on its ID, right? So whenever you have an ID, remember you can set an ID in your HTML, and that would be the equivalent of saying, hey, I'm gonna give this a unique identifying piece of information that I'm gonna use to refer to this either in CSS or either in the CSS, my bad, I didn't mean to close that, either in the CSS, right? Or in the JavaScript when I'm using some of these document object model functions. So we have an element with an ID called board. So we might want to use this to get the board somehow. That's totally something that we could do. InnerHTML is a property that we can access using JavaScript that will change the inside of an HTML element. So InnerHTML can change any of the HTML that's inside of another element. These are two of them. I wonder if they just have a reference to all of the other functions. I don't know why they did it this way, or they didn't show it here. Let's see. Okay, cool. So when it comes to the document object model, there's a couple of key points that you might want to figure out. One is like, okay, how do I find specific elements? Well, there's a couple different functions that we can use that do that. Document get element by ID. In this case, the document is referring to the HTML document that the JavaScript is connected to. So get element by ID would find an element based on that ID. Get elements by tag name finds it by tag name, or get elements by class name, finds element by the class name. We can also change HTML elements. So that InnerHTML value allows you to swap the HTML inside of another HTML tag. So I could, if I went and found this element and I said, change this div's InnerHTML, I would be changing anything inside of this div. So all the stuff that is inside of this element right here, which technically right now is all my squares, I could change all of those if I wanted to change the InnerHTML. You can also change an element's attribute. So you can change any attribute that the element has. You can change any of the style and the properties of styles using JavaScript. There's so much that JavaScript can do to change HTML elements. Adding and removing of elements, you can use the document object model to create, remove, and append and replace new HTML elements. So you can totally change up the entire HTML page using these methods. Cool. So then there's all types of other methods here that we can use to find HTML elements or HTML objects as well. So we're going to use some of these functions in other specific ways. And the whole purpose of understanding the DOM is that there's so much that you can use JavaScript to do in order to manipulate these HTML pages. So, whether it's looking for these elements by their tag or by their class name, we can also look up HTML elements by CSS selectors. And this helps us find elements that might be utilizing specific things like an ID, class names, different types of attributes. This allows us to then say, okay, well, cool. Like, I know what I want to do here first is I want to be able to know what's going on the board, right? So I might want to have some references to the elements that make up this board, right? And if I looked at these elements on the actual inspector, right? We have this board that is all of those squares. inside of that board, we have each individual square, right? So I might want to keep a reference to all of these things. So I know, okay, each individual square is part of this board. So when it comes to actually rendering that board, like I was talking about before in the JavaScript, right? When we come to rendering this, I might need to know some things about the board as it relates to the squares, right? That are part of each part of that make up the board in the HTML, right? So one thing I might want to do is keep a reference to all of those squares. So it just is easier for me to manipulate them using JavaScript. So rather than each time having to find them, I might just like I did before, set some variables that I can use over and over again to make my life a little bit easier. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call it, because I don't want this to change, I'm going to make it a constant. I'm going to call it squares. And this variable is going to use the DocumentObjectModel function. I was going to say use the DOM to get a reference to all of our squares, right? That's our goal here. So I'm going to create this variable called squares. And what I want to do is I'm going to use the document. And there's so many different ones I could use. I could use, you know, I could get elements by class name. I could do all types of stuff at this point. But really what I'm trying to target are all of those divs, these individual divs, right? So these divs have a class name of square, but they're also all contained within the board. So you could choose which document object model function you want to use, but the one I'm going to use just for the sake of this particular tutorial is I'm going to get all of the, I'm going to use the query selector all function, which uses the CSS selector to find all the elements that it returns all the elements that match this corresponding, that are the descendants of this corresponding selector. So query selector all lets you pass in a string that that represents the selector of the element that you're looking to target. So this is what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to say, okay, well, I want to target, I want the board, but I want not only the board, I want all of the elements that are the squares underneath the board. Because who knows, maybe later I use this square class somewhere else. So if I just targeted, you know, all the class name squares, well, if I had a square that was outside of this board, right, and I just made a new div, and I gave this div a class called square, right? Technically, this would also get targeted, but I don't want that to get targeted. So here I'm being very specific and saying, find the board, find all the squares that are underneath the board, right? The board element. So here I'm gonna do that by saying the ID board, right? And I'm gonna say get all the divs, find all the divs that are descendants of the board, right? And so again, we can test what that selector looks like just really quickly by kind of putting it in the CSS as a simple rule. And you'll see when you hover over it, what this is gonna find is any div underneath any element with the ID of board. But since we know we only have one ID board in our file, and that means that we're only gonna get those divs that represent the divs that comprise our board. So just a little bit of like kind of specificity here. But of course, you could use some of the other document object model functions to achieve this in this kind of simple use case. But you know, things aren't always as simple as this is right now. So cool. So now we kind of got these squares, right? And so what we did last time was we console logged the squares. And in doing that, right, when we go to the console, we see that we're getting back this node list, which is dope, of all of the squares. So as I kind of highlight over each one, I see the individual squares that make up the board, which is dope. That's exactly what we wanted to do. But the problem is, what is a node list? You know, that's not an actual data type that is easy to understand in JavaScript. But even if you look at the console here, what data type does this look like outside of this node list with these square brackets here?
An array.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a good chance that this node list could be easily converted to an array. And this is really interesting, right? because certain data types that come back from the document object model are going to be in a weird format. It's not going to be like, it's not going to automatically push it back into JavaScript. So what's going to be important is for us to think about what data type can we use to actually convert this to something that we can use in JavaScript. All arrays follow a very simple principle. They are ordered by 0 to whatever the length is, and hold a specific element at each of those indexes, right? So seeing just how this node list is structured, and even seeing how it kind of returned it back, gives us kind of a pretty good inclination that it might be good for us to try to convert this to an array. In most languages, right, when you have a specific data type or some, those data types are reflected by classes. And JavaScript is the same, where JavaScript arrays have a whole interface for them that is like a whole kind of class like interface, right? It has its own constructor, has its own functions. And one of the functions that the array class has is an array from function. And the array from function basically creates a new array from any array-like object, right? So this is just for the shorthand of like saying like, what we want to do is convert this to an array, and we can use the array from method to do that. So rather than make this squares stay as a node list, we want to convert this into an array. So one way to do this is to basically use that array from function and just kind of wrap this function over that, right? So we're saying, hey, take this document query selector all thing that's returning this node list and make an array from that, right? Then when we console log the squares, right, we're going to get it back as an actual array, and same looking thing, but it's of type array, which means that we can very easily use this in JavaScript and make use of all the different array functions that are part of this. So our first goal of getting this squares, each of our squares represented is complete. We're kind of good on that now, which is great. So now that we have the squares, each square represented in our board, right? Now I can actually start making some cool use of the JavaScript document object model function to actually do this piece of rendering our board in our HTML. So I don't necessarily want to, what I want to do is whenever we initialize the board, I want to reset everything to be empty, right? And then I want that change to be reflected in our actual board, right? I want to see that kind of take place. But every time somebody makes a turn on the board, we're going to want to do the same thing of like understand where they made that move and make the change in the JavaScript and make that change on the HTML. So I might, because that work seems like it's going to happen multiple times, rather than write all of this only in this init function, I'm actually going to create a new function that I'm going to call render. So I'm going to say let render, and I'm going to create a new function, for it, right? And I'm going to say let render, and this render function is going to be responsible for this goal of rendering the new board in our HTML. So what I might do in the init function is actually call the render function, but we're going to have to define it so that it knows what to call. So this render function, right, what it's going to do is we need this to look at the JavaScript board and update the HTML board, basically, right? That's what we want this to do. So we're going to want to take this array from our JavaScript and just make sure that it's consistently being updated with the right information on our HTMLs. Because here is where we're going to actually make our X's and O's, right? And that's where we're going to want to see that reflected in the HTML, right? So what we need this render function to do is first look through this array and make sure that it's taking every mark that it finds and saying, okay, for each mark that we see on here in this array, let's put that mark on the actual board, reflected inside of the HTML of this board somehow. So cool. So in order to look at the JavaScript board and update the HTML board, step one is look, it's kind of iterate through our board array, right? So JavaScript arrays, and the fact that we have this as an array, it makes this very easy. We talked about for loops in the other day, but we also saw that with arrays, there's certain functions that you can use that make iteration over those items easier. So I can use the for each function of our board to essentially iterate through this board and make it so that we are taking a look at all of those different taking a look at all the different elements inside of this array, and then making something specific happen for it, right? So when you use the any JavaScript function that takes in another function, so the for each function is a function that takes in another function. And that sometimes gets confusing with the JavaScript functions, but we're using this for each function, and we got to pass in another function that's going to run for every element of the board. So element here is just a variable name. We can call this anything. So I could call this mark, to just say like, the mark, that each mark that's there, like X or O. But I could just use element if I want to. It's up to you what you call it. But the idea here is the same. What we're going to do is for each of those different elements inside of that array, or each mark that's inside of our board on our JavaScript board, we want to make sure that we are setting the corresponding square in our HTML to show that particular character, right? So we're doing a couple interesting things here. So first step was iterate through the array. Step 2 is to edit the HTML with the corresponding mark, right? So we're going to want to make sure that we take whatever that mark is, and we make sure that we edit the HTML, with that corresponding item. So let me get through this piece, and then I'll answer your question, brother. So how are we going to do that? Well, we know that we have this array called squares, right? And squares is an array that represents all of the different squares in our board on the HTML side, right? So the cool thing is with this, here with this particular, with this square, right? Each square is an element. So we can actually use the JavaScript to go a little bit further into manipulating some of the different HTML that each of those elements have, right? So like I said, we could change some of the inner HTML, and we can make it so that this JavaScript is changing some of the attributes or really anything, right? So what we're going to do is use some JavaScript to change our element a little bit and say, okay, for every square that we're going to take a look at, we might want to change one property that is called text content. And the text content, let's see if they have something about the text content in here. Oh no. So just like it has HTML content, each element has certain text content that we can manipulate as well. So I guess a good way to show you all this is this. So I'm going to just target this particular square. So like, let's say, for instance, I was, I'm looking at this square that's highlighted here, which in the console is represented here with this $0 for right now. There's a bunch of different attributes, or like I should say properties and methods that I can use to manipulate this element, right? Inner text is one of them. But also we see things like some other keys for like events and stuff like that, which we'll talk about in a second. But there's all these different element types of properties that we can manipulate also within the JavaScript. So we're going to use that inner text. And you see right now it says that inner text is empty string here at the bottom. But if I set this to something like, something else, right? You can see that, oh, well, changing that inner text is going to change how, what this div is actually showing. So that's exactly what we're going to use to make this change. The question though is, how are we going to know which particular square is corresponding to what, right? This for each loop is going to look through each item look through every item of this array. And we know we can get back the mark. Each mark is going to be, each element of this array. But one other thing to know is that when you use the for each function, you can also optionally pass in an additional parameter that will represent the index of the array. So here I'm going to not only have the mark, which is going to refer to X or O or whatever, or empty string. I can also get back what I called index, which will be a variable that is declared to be to be which index of this array am I at right now. So not only do I get the value there, I get the index also. So I can say, hey, for that particular index that's coming back, I'm going to find the corresponding index of our squares array. And I'm going to say for that specific element, because remember, the squares array is an array of all of these elements. So I'm going to say for that particular element, this one or that one or whatever, I want to change the inner text of that particular element. So I'm going to say squares at that particular index. And I'm going to say, I'm just going to change the text content, and I'm going to set that equal to the mark at that particular for that particular thing. So this is going to change it's going to go through all the marks of the board, and it's going to change the text content of each of those squares to be that corresponding mark. So that's really great. So when we save this now, because we have some X's and O's here on the board, the hope is that when this refreshes, that we see, mark's not defined. Why is that doing that to me? Why are you doing this to, I don't know why this did this. Sometimes when you have multiple parameters here, you have to have them wrapped in a parentheses. So I'm just gonna do that, make sure that this is all good. Okay, cool. So now we got the X's and the O's showing up the right way on the board. But clearly we don't want the board to start out with a bunch of X's and O's. We want when it first gets initialized and it renders to render with an empty board. So we're gonna render it back with an empty board. But now we see, if we do put some X's and O's here, those are gonna get reflected inside of the HTML when the board actually gets rendered, which is great. That's exactly what we want to have happen here. So I'm gonna take a quick pause. Any questions? Go ahead, bro. I know, Eric, you got a question. Go ahead, Eric.
I think actually you already answered my question. It's like because I followed the tutorial and the tutorial used like the previous syntax with the function and stuff. I was a little bit confused because yeah, but I understand now like how everything is working.
Yeah, so if you follow the tutorial that I put the actual tutorial that we're talking through on Slack that I sent out, she uses the old function syntax, which is still viable. You can use that syntax, but I'm going to use arrow syntax just because it's a little newer and more kind of up to date. Same stuff though. Angelo, go ahead, bro.
Yeah, so like at the top, can you explain what like const squares means and like basically everything after the equal sign?
Yeah. So squares is just a variable. We're calling this making a variable. So remember that const is a keyword that means that we can't change this. So this is not going to be editable. I won't be able to swap the elements of the array, right? But what on the right-hand side, we're using that document query selector all function, which basically is a function that looks for a list of different nodes that match this corresponding selector. So in this selector, we're saying find all of the divs that are within an element called board with the ID of board. And so the only elements that are type div that are underneath an element with ID board are all of our squares. for the game. And so we're basically targeting all 9 of those squares with this one selector and saying, so get that as a list. And that list brings us back a list of all of those nodes that we saw that corresponded to each of the different squares. But what we're doing last is saying, because we don't want to work with some weird HTML object that isn't easy to iterate over or use these array functions on, we're going to turn it into a JavaScript array using the array from function. And this array function is going to turn this to an actual array that we can use that still corresponds to the various elements of the HTML. Because remember what we talked about with JavaScript is you can use the array to store all types of stuff. It's still storing the HTML objects, but it's storing it as an array, which is why later we can do things like this, squares at index and stuff like that to access all of those different items. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and in the render function, did you just put like another function inside of that function?
So this for each, so the for each function, right, is a function we use with arrays to iterate over an array. So rather than write a for loop and then for each and for the length of the array and blah 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 blah, arrays have a built-in function that lets you iterate through them. And for every item of the array, so for every item of the array, it's gonna run this function that I highlighted right here. And this function, as you can see, is just another arrow function, right? I could have this function basically is another arrow function, just like render is an arrow function, right? And it's saying for every mark in index, take the squares array at that particular index and change the text content to be whatever the mark is. And
okay,
mark,
cool.
Yeah, go ahead.
And I don't want to ask like a stupid question, but we initialize board inside of one function, so it just it's like global, right? Because
so
we're
board.
using
So
it
remember that board. I initialized that variable above, just so that I can use it. So I can use it in all those functions. No, that's a great question, because let variables, remember, are not global by default. They're only global based on the scope they were defined in. So I made this one relatively quote unquote global by defining it outside of any of the functions, which is why all of the functions can use them, even though this is a let variable. So that's a great question.
All right, cool. I forgot we initialized it up there actually.
No problem. Dope. Any other questions? Is this making sense so far though? If it is, just drop a thumbs up real quick so I know that we Gucci out here in these virtual Zoom streets. Nice. Cool. Appreciate y'all coming over here and just throwing some thumbs up. All right, bet. So yeah, I'll make sure I leave some room to talk about questions in a second. All right, cool. So we got the board showing up. We can render the actual items inside of our board, right? We don't want it to start out with anything in there, but we know that we can render it the right way. And each time the render function gets called, we're actually gonna we're gonna go back through that list of we're gonna go back through the board and we're gonna update the HTML. That's great. That's all we really need to do for that for the time being. So now the thing you're probably wondering is like, okay, well, how are we actually gonna play this? That's cool. That's cool that you can see me X, you can show me O, like that's great. But how are we actually gonna play this, right? I wanna actually click and see some stuff happen. And that's where we're gonna use some other document object model functions to manipulate, like handle the turns, right? And handle what happens when a user is playing the game, right? So clearly we're gonna want some type of action to take place when a user is taking a turn, right? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to just create another, I'm going to create another function. I'm going to just create it up here. I'm going to call it handle turn. And this is going to be a function that is responsible for processing when a user basically makes a move on the board, right? So we're gonna need this function to do something. But first thing we need to figure out is how do I know when the user is taking a turn, right? In this game, it's going to be when somebody clicks on the board, right? Clicks on our screen somewhere. So the first thing I need to do is figure out how am I going to actually handle when a user is clicking on the screen. And then once I know that a user's clicked on the screen, maybe I want to handle the turn the way I was just talking about, right? So processing processing clicks in JavaScript is an interesting concept. What that is referring to are called events. Events are a really important concept in JavaScript that are responding to different user actions in HTML events. Some types of events you might be really familiar with are mouse overs, where a person moves their mouse over something. Clicks, where once you click on something, something happens. So these are called events in HTML. You can make it so that JavaScript can react to different events. JavaScript can take notice of an event going on and send a function, call a function to handle whenever something happens. So for instance, you can use, you can say, hey, whenever a user clicks on something, we're gonna run some JavaScript, right? And so these are also things that we can do using the document object model standpoint here. So let's talk about how we're gonna make this kind of event handler work with making it so we know when a user's clicking. And that's what we're gonna do when it comes to, so we have our element references, and we're gonna need to have, we're gonna need to actually put in some event listener. So before we handle the turn, we're actually gonna need to, the biggest event listener we're gonna need to know is handle when a user clicks on the board, right? So what we're gonna need to do is figure that out, right? And so there's easy ways to do this using the document object model function. So, or using the document object model. So whenever you want to create an event, right? Whenever you want to react to an event, you need to create what's called an event listener. And an event listener is created by way of saying, by basically taking a specific element, right? And you're saying, hey, for this particular element, add an event listener for whatever specific event you're trying to listen for. So clicks, mouse overs, there's all types of events, drags and drops, all types of stuff, right? Anything that you normally do on the browser is an event that you can process. But what we need to do is find the particular element that we want the event listener to be on. We can add the event listener for a specific event, and we can pass a function that we want to run whenever that event is triggered. That's how that works. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. First, we're gonna kind of find an element. So in this case, right, what element makes most sense for me to kind of listen to clicks on? It might be the whole board, right? It could do it on each individual square, but that I would have to set that up a lot more complicated fashions than if I just say, hey, listen to any clicks on the entire board, right? So first, I'm going to just say get element by ID. I'm going to say get element by ID board, right? And for that board, I'm going to add an event listener that's going to process clicks, right? So there's all types of different events. So we can see a couple of them here because of VS Code, right? Clicks, blurs, changes, copies, drags, drag drops, you know what I'm saying? Like focuses, key presses. So if there was a specific key press that I wanted to take a look, listen to, like all these events are things you can use JavaScript to respond to and I should say react to, if I want to give y'all a preference, a pre-note on why that might be the name there. But anyway, we're going to listen to clicks. And what we need to do is every time we hear a click, we need to pass some function that's going to get called by this event listener whenever a click happens. So that's exactly why we made that handle turn function, which is going to be called whenever a user actually clicks the board. So for now, I'm just going to console log. You clicked me. You clicked me. So click. Man, I gotta move this. My bad, y'all. My bad, fam. Let me do this. Dope. You clicked me, brother. You clicked me. Dope. So we're referencing those clicks. It's calling our handle turn function, and everything's good. So now we know that whenever the board gets clicked on, we're going to actually be put into our handle turn function, which is great because this is where we want to process when a user is making a move on the board, right? So this is great right here. So one of the things that's important to know is that whenever an event listener function, in this case handle turn, is called, this handle turn function is going to receive a specific object that it can utilize to process the event that it was listening to, and that is called it's called an event object. But in order to access it, we can pass it into our function as a parameter. I don't know if you necessarily have to. I'm just side noting to myself, but I think it's good practice to put that in there. So instead of console logging, after console logging, you click me. And then here's something cool that you might not know, but with console logs, you can chain them. So you can chain another thing you want to print just by putting a comma. So here I'm gonna say you clicked me, and then I'm actually gonna log that event to just see if this comes back the right thing as I expect. Cool. So you clicked me, and here's the actual event that comes back. So this event is going to show us all the data that comes from that one click that somebody touched. This might seem crazy that somebody can get all this information just from a click on your web browser, but we can get all this information just from a click on the web browser, right? So when you think about like apps that are tracking stuff, like they're tracking a lot of stuff. You know what I'm saying? Like they definitely tracking what you click it on, you know what I mean? But I digress. We could talk about that another time. One of the most important things that come out of, so there's a lot of important things that come out of that event object, right? Is like all this information about where you clicked and stuff like that. Like what pixel numbers did you click on the screen? But one of the most important variables we use often with events is this target. The target is a variable that will tell you which element triggered this event, basically. And so here, the target clearly is saying this particular square, right? So this is the square I actually clicked on, but it's giving me back that square as an object that I can refer to. If I use the target value or use the target, I'm going to get back that particular square. So you might kind of already know what needs to happen next. Now that we are in the handle turn function, our first step is to figure out which square the user clicked. Well, we know that is going to be the target, right? The event target. We kind of already figured that out, event.target, right? But what we want to do now is not only, so we know which square the user clicked by way of the event.target, right? But what we really want to do is update our, is basically, we're going to want to update our board at that particular index. So this is kind of going to get a little confusing for a second. We know what square got clicked. Like, let me break this down. We know what square got clicked, right? But basically now what we need to do is say, hey, this square got clicked. We got to figure out what square is this in our squares array, right? So we can see this square, but what square is this in our squares array? That probably is 0, 1, 2, right? And then from that, we're going to say, okay, what square is this in our squares array? And then we're going to want to say, okay, cool, we found that particular element, and we're going to want to figure out what index this is so that we can update our board at that particular index and give it an X or give it an O, depending on whatever the thing was. So we're gonna figure out what square the user clicked in our array. And then we're gonna update our board at that particular index. So in order to do this first step, we're gonna need to get an index. We need to figure out, like I say, let's figure out the index of the square the user clicked in our array. So to get that, we're gonna say, okay, let's let the index, I'm gonna just call it IDX for now, get back the squares. So squares is our whole list of arrays, right? And what's convenient about having the squares as an array, so to Angela's question, why do we convert this to an array even in the first place, is because now we got access to all these array functions that make our life easier. If this was Java, y'all be banging your head on the wall. This would be a DSA problem. Y'all be like, dang, this OD, I don't want to do this. But this is JavaScript, and JavaScript is cool. You know what I'm saying? JavaScript got a find index function for us. So we just go use that find index function. But like most array functions in JavaScript, find index takes in another function as a parameter, but the function basically is going to return the conditional that we're going to look for to determine the index we're looking for. So that's a lot of confusing words, but basically this function, so I'm going to make an empty arrow function for now. This function has to just set the preference, the prerequisites that we're looking for returning something as true. So what is the thing we're looking for that is going to return the right index? So basically what we're going to look for is the index where the return where the square that we're seeing in our squares array is equal to the event.target, right? And you see I'm using these triple equals here, which is just me being extra precautious that the square I'm gonna look at in my squares array is the same div.square that is in my event.target. So remember, the triple equals basically says, not only do I want these things to have the same value, but I want them to be the same type. So this is just me being super precautious. This function right here is gonna look through all the squares in the squares array, and for every square, just like in our for each, right? For every element, we're going to take that element and we're going to say, is this element equal to the to our event.target? And if it is, it's going to return that index. So it's going to find the first instance where this is true and give us back that index number. So now I got that index, which is great. So the next step I need to do is I need to update the board. So I'm going to take that index. I'm going to say at that particular index, I want to set the board, right? Remember, the board is just a list of characters. So I'm trying to set the string there to be whoever's turn it was, right? Because first it was X's turn, but maybe next time it's O's turn. So we're just going to say turn, whoever's turn it was, right? And then, so yeah, let's just stop there and see if that worked, right? So first we did the event handler. We knew it was clicking, but now after it clicks, it should find the index of where it clicked and mark that with the particular X or O. So I'm gonna just look around, I'm clicking, but I lost my thing here. I don't know why that's the case though. Handle turn, the click. Let me just make sure this is still processing.
I think you're not rendering, Professor.
Oh, no, see, thank you, bro. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
No, that's great. So yeah, no, that's a good point, right? Because I can be doing all of this the right way, right? I'm updating the board, right? So here I'm updating the board, but after I update the board, right? After this gets updated, just like we did in the init function, I need to render the change. I need the change to actually be, I need the board to get looked at and then actually change the text content, right? Great looks, bro. Appreciate that. I would have been looking dumb for 8 minutes. So I say render the change on the board. Yeah, great. So that's as simple as just calling the render function again. That's exactly why we made that function, so that we make this a little bit easier for us. So now, let's try it again. So every time I click, cool, I'm clicking. I got that process from the console log that says I'm clicked. but now whenever I click, I'm getting the X's on the board. But clearly tic-tac-toe doesn't just work with X's, it works with X's and O's. So the next thing I might want to do is before I leave this handle turn function, I might want to intermediate step here. I would say step, 2.5 is swap turns, right? So that we know, okay, it's O's turn now, or it's, whoever's turn it is. So one way to do this is I could do kind of like a if else kind of scenario, like a if else kind of block, and just say, if turn is equal to X, I'm saying turn gets O, whoops, else turn gets X, right? So I could do this, right? And this technically should work. So let's just make sure that that's the case. I got X, I got O, I got X, I got O, I got X, I got O, X, O, X. Dope. So there, we got our little board up. We got like our moves being made. And we actually are representing X's and O's here. The only other step here to make this a more complete tic-tac-toe game would be to actually determine like who's the winner, and making sure we stop the game at that point, and maybe we could do some other things to make sure that we maybe show whose turn it is, right? But those are little things in comparison to this big part of making sure that our board is rendering with the right changes and showing whose move on the board actually is there. So I'm gonna stop this here. If you're interested in this, I definitely would recommend you go through the tutorial, because it'll go through all those other steps of actually making the text change and figuring out who won and all of that. So it'll be good practice for you if you want to do that. But I want to kind of pause here and just kind of talk through what we really were doing here, right? And the point of this. Here, we got this really interesting JavaScript file now. And I'll make sure that I send y'all a link to my GitHub repository with some code there for you to take a look at. But essentially, right, this JavaScript function is taking this HTML document that we have here. And it's saying, hey, for this HTML element, we're going to connect this JavaScript so that it has a document to manipulate. And that HTML, this JavaScript file is going to be the brains of this web page, right? Really, right? So, we gave it some variables that it could have reference to. We made sure that it got references to some specific elements on the screen so that it can make sure it made changes to the DOM through that. And we put a bunch of JavaScript functions in there that are just logical functions, right? Outside of this stuff with like the squares and you would agree that these are some of the same things we were doing the other day with JavaScript, finding, using an array and, some if else's are in there, right? Like the only thing that's new here is the document object model functions that are, pretty sophisticated in what they're doing. But the basic parts of the JavaScript are really kind of similar, right? Functions, arrays, other functions, right? This is how JavaScript actually works in the web. It's not always super complicated. It's just really doing some complicated things with regards to manipulating the DOM for us. And in this little tic-tac-toe game, you can see how complicated that process can be of making sure you have references to specific elements and knowing how to manipulate those elements over time, making sure you're setting up event listeners, right? Because those are the things that actually make the JavaScript interact with the HTML. Everything else with the JavaScript is relatively straightforward. It's about creating functions that are making certain things happen for the program, right? A big kind of reason that I structured this app this way, and that I'm glad that the person that made this tutorial structured her app this way, is because the use of this function render is actually really provocative and setting us up for our conversation on Tuesday, where we're going to start talking more specifically about React. Because here you see, JavaScript might be doing all types of stuff, like in that handle turn function. I'm doing all types of really interesting JavaScript work, but I really need to always make sure I'm rendering those changes back on the screen for the user to see, right? And this is a really important concept that happens in React about rendering changes into the UI. And so we're going to see that render come back up and literally on Tuesday. But what's really interesting here, I think, is how this sets us up to think about some of the benefits of something like React. So just to wrap us up for today, just give me one more minute and I'll close this out. The React docs is a great place for you to spend some time these next few days now that we built this tutorial. Just reading through it. We're going to talk more specifically about it on Tuesday. But they have a really interesting tutorial, funny enough, that teaches you how to build tic-tac-toe in React. So if I were you, I would go ahead and finish this tutorial in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and literally just go over this next one in React and see some of the differences that are going on within the two. You might have some trouble setting it up to start. That's okay. We'll go through that on Tuesday. But if you do get it set up and you can get it going, it'll be great to kind of get some comparisons in there. A lot of what React allows us to do and helps us out with are the processes of JavaScript here that we're getting a little bit confusing. Things like caching element references, or keeping track of app state variables, like things that are going to be changing over time in our application that we might want to have a more a larger variable to keep track of, right? And then functions that ultimately will then update our UI in interesting ways and conditional ways, right? React makes a lot of this process easier than continuously making element references and event listeners. And it also kind of combines some of what we're doing with the HTML here and the JavaScript by making use of elements in React that are kind of a hybrid of HTML and JavaScript, to allow us to make it easier for us to reference the elements we want to style on our UI. So this is all really great stuff to start looking into as we're going to get deeper into the web dev space. I hope you enjoyed kind of walking through this with me. And like I said, if I were you, I would maybe try to finish this up to get this working like a regular game. I could show you, I'm trying to remember the URL, but I made a version of tic-tac-toe that, funny enough, was using, it was a presidential election version. So I'm gonna send that to y'all in the Slack when I find I forgot the URL, but I'll send that to y'all in the Slack. And yeah, it's just cool to know that you have your first something nice that you built real quick in the first couple of weeks of class. So this is a great tutorial to walk through, but stuff. So definitely recommend that you take a look at the tutorial there. And if not the tutorial, just looking through some of the docs, right? We're going to be going through the main concepts here of React and creating a new React application starting on Tuesday. So appreciate y'all. And as always, I hope that you are living well spiritually, mentally, and physically. And yeah, looking forward to